Okay, so let's talk about game balance. We're going to talk about creating room for meaningful choice, because as we've discussed, all of these, this application of mechanics is about making sure that the player has choices to make in each given moment and decisions to make, because that active decision making and also the act of learning the game, those are all like actually fairly like emotional and I don't know, like sticky actions for people. Like people like being able to make decisions, not a lot of them, but a few of them at a time. So what is game balance? This is the act of adjusting elements in the game until they deliver the desired experience. So one of the things that hopefully that you're doing as you're starting to develop this game and this document that you're making is you're deciding what is the experience that I want my player to have. And once you have that answered, you can say, all right, does the game feel right? Does it feel balanced? Does it feel like the game is doing the things that I want it to do minute to minute? Is the player having the reactions that I want them to have? And at its essence, that's, approximately what game balance is about. But it also gets a lot more mathematical than that as you get into the nitty-gritty of it. So balance can mean making rules feel fair, making choices feel rewarding, making the player feel like they have freedom, and lots of other things. So sometimes those feelings of fairness are not actual mathematical fairness. You know what I mean? If a game, is supposed to have you make a 50-50 dice roll where you have a 50% chance of succeeding and failing, it may not actually feel fair until it's like actually 60% in the player's favor, that sort of thing. So it's not really about actually implementing fairness and reward and freedom. It's about making the player feel like that's what's happening. So why balance the game? Good balance gives choices meaning. It eliminates dominant strategies, and it lets players control their own experience. So a dominant strategy is when one choice emerges as clearly better than the rest. The play space closes and no more choices can be made. There might be choices to make, but players aren't going to make them because there's one strategy that is just clearly better than all the other ones. So the game's no longer fun because there's not any interesting decisions to make, and it quickly becomes easy, which creates feelings of boredom. So one of the reasons that we balance a game is to eliminate those. We want to make sure that there's always a couple of choices that the player can make at a given time, right? And we want players to be able to control their own experience. We want them to feel like they're in control. If you're not aware, that feeling is called autonomy, and that's something that we're trying to maximize when players are playing. And part of that is because, with any game, as we discussed before, the definition of a game even is like a rule system that you consent to enter, that you want to do. And so a game has to feel playful, right? It has to feel like there's some choices to be made. Meaningful ones. So some types of balance are fairness, challenge, choices, chance and skill, rewards, punishments, and positive and negative feedback loops. And we can talk about each of those in detail. So fairness. In a symmetrical game, all players have the same resources and powers. So chess is an example of a symmetrical game. These are easy to balance because the starting conditions are the same for everybody. In an asymmetrical game, players have different resources and skills and roles, but they should all be equally playable. So a game like Overwatch or Settlers of Catan might be kind of asymmetrical, right? Because you all have different starting resources. But you can start in any point in that game. You can start with any character and still be able to progress and win. So most games are asymmetrical because this tends to make for a more interesting play space. So how can we balance when we don't know how the different roles, strategies, or equipment necessarily affects the game? So one of the ways that we can balance asymmetry is to assign numerical values. So you can sort of assign these values to different aspects of your system and then make sure that all the different choices and values add up to the same amount. So in this example, again, this is from the Art of Game Design. We have, I'll get rid of my video here. So in the biplane balance example, we can imagine a game of a biplane dogfight combat where each player gets to choose one of the following planes. So there are 3 planes, the Piranha, the Revenger, and the Sopwith Camel. And they each have like a speed, maneuverability, and firepower value. So this could be medium, high, or low. So one of the things that you could do is you could assign a number to each of those values, or to each of those like stats. So you could say low gives 1 point, medium gives 2 points, and high gives 3 points. So when you're looking at how these planes have been set up, you can see that the Piranha and the Revenger have 6 and 7 points respectively, where the Camel only has 4. So that means the Camel's probably unbalanced. It's probably too weak compared to the others, right? All right, so now what we can do is we can decide that firepower is maybe the most important, stat out of all of these, and we'll say we'll just double those points. So now in the example of firepower, low is equal to 2 points, medium is equal to 4 points, and high would be equal to 6 points. But there are no planes that have high firepower. It's a little bit more balanced now. We end up with our Piranha and our Revenger both having 8 points, which means they are balanced with each other, but the Camel's still a little on the low side. And so what that means is at this point, we have to decide how to, like, in which stat to sort of like give it some extra points so that it will be balanced out. Maybe our speed and maneuverability are doing okay. It's got low speed, low maneuverability. So let's give it high firepower. Let's make it so that there is an example of a high firepower plane here. Now, with the totals balanced out and added up, we get 8, 8, 8. We know that these planes are roughly balanced, and we, can like proceed with playtesting. We think that this is going to be a little more fun to play. So that's an example of asymmetrical balance. So the planes are not all identical. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses, but we made sure that the strengths and weaknesses kind of balance out. And then mechanically, we can take those values and actually like apply them to real numbers, right? In our programming. Another way to approach asymmetry is to make sure that every choice or power or role is strong against some choice and weak against a different choice, so that each choice has an equally viable strategy. So rock, paper, scissors is the way that we normally describe this style of asymmetrical balance, and fighting games are kind of the quintessential example of that. So movesets in fighting games are usually they take on this rock, paper, scissors model where they're always strong against something and weak against something. Okay, so our next kind of balance is in challenge, difficulty, player experience, and accommodation. So players are most engaged when they're in what's called the flow state, and this is when they don't feel so challenged that they're getting frustrated, and they don't feel like so that everything's so easy that they're getting bored. You don't want frustration or boredom. You want this in-between space where people start to lose time to the game that they're playing, and they get like transported by it. I'm sure you've all felt that while playing games. So that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for flow state. So you should strive to create and adjust challenges based on differing skill level or ability of players. Not all players want a really, really hard challenge, and not all players want things to be very easy and explained to them. So one of the ways that we can get around this is to provide difficulty levels or experience levels, and allow players to kind of adjust them on the fly is one way to do this, so that people can kind of tune their own experience. In Celeste, there's assist mode, so you don't have to necessarily frame your different gameplay modes in terms of difficulty, so you don't have to say they're easy, regular, or hard, but in terms of what the player wants to get out of it. So you might say this is story mode, where mostly you're going to be focusing on the story and everything else is, like a little less important than that. This is combat mode, where, hardcore, difficult combat is going to be the focus of what you're doing in this mode. In assist mode, you could turn on and off different game components, sort of independent of one another. So you could take different parts of the challenge and say, for example, I'm going to turn off stamina. Now, stamina is just not going to be like part of the mechanic for the game, but I still want all of the other mechanics. And you could kind of tune it for yourself that way. Okay, Next, we have choice. So this is balancing choice and desire. So if there are more choices than there are desires, so if there's more things to make a decision about than there are things that the players want, then the player may get overwhelmed. And if there are fewer choices than there are desires, the player is going to get frustrated. But if there are just as many choices as there are desires, which is usually like a fairly small number, let's say 3-ish, then the player will feel freedom and autonomy because they have to make a hard choice, but it's not too hard and it's not, it's not nothing. So this goes back to the economies that we discussed. How can we create game loops that create meaningful choice and are in line with the different players' desires at a given time? So if we look at that Dark Souls example, for example, where you have a choice between spending your souls on permanently progressing your character's stats, or you can spend them on, on an item that might be useful to you in a particular situation. That might be just enough choices that the player, is able to make their choice relatively uncomplicatedly, but they still have different things that they want. They might say like, oh, well, I definitely want to level up over spending an item, but I don't exactly know whether to spend this on strength or on stamina or on magic, for example. But then maybe that choice is made more obvious to them as they kind of get like streamlined into a different build. So you just want to make sure that you are playtesting a lot and seeing where players want to make more choices than they have, and maybe where players want to make fewer choices than they currently have. So one way to balance choice is to provide some low risk, low reward options and some high risk, high reward options. So a low risk, low reward option means it's cheap, but it's not going to give you very much. So if it's like an economy choice, you can say like, well, this doesn't cost very much, but it's not going to be like, overly useful to me. So maybe that means that when you're pricing your items in a Souls game, you price them fairly low so that it's an easy decision for a player to make, to say, oh, well, this is only going to cost like 1,000 souls. I have 10,000. Sure, I'll buy some items. And then conversely, you can make high risk, high reward options. In a Souls game, again, the choice here is, do I progress further in a level, or do I go back and spend what I had at the well, not the risk, knowing that all the enemies are going to respawn? Do I feel comfortable enough like going through this again, or am I going to look for the next bonfire? There's also chance versus skill. So some games are entirely skill-based games. Something like Go is almost entirely skill-based. And then some games are almost entirely chance. So Plinko, which is you basically drop a coin in a thing with a bunch of pegs, and the thing will go down through the pegs and land somewhere. The only choice that you get to make is where you drop the coin. Everything else is RNG, right? Everything else is random. But most games are a combination of skill and randomness. So if you alternate pure chance, which is a dice roll, a card deal, or RNG, which is a random number generator, with pure skill and strategy, you can create a really pleasurable experience of having made some decisions that are based in your skill at that game that you've attained so far. And other things are random surprises, maybe good random surprises. Maybe it's not all bad. I'm sure we've all rolled 20 in D&D or rolled 1 and been very happy or very sad, but it's always memorable, right? So there are rewards. Rewards make us feel good, so we seek them out. They literally help us release serotonin and dopamine in our bodies. So reward is something that players are going to inherently seek. This could be praise, like praise from the game, praise from other players. It could be points. It could be more time to play. If you're looking at something like Candy Crush, for example, doing well in the game allows you more time before it's going to cut down on your lives. It might be keys and gates. So if you have found some keys and you suddenly find a gate, it's a reward to be able to open it and see what's on the other side. Could be aesthetics. So I think that's where cutscenes fall, or narrative. Maybe you just want to see how the story is going to progress. It could be expression, so the ability for the player to show who they are. So maybe that's, something like outfit or glamours. It could be power, leveling up. It feels really nice when you suddenly go back to a starting area and you're really powerful. Could be resources, especially in a survival game or something like that, where resources are usually scarce. Finding them is a huge reward. And it can be completion. So just knowing that you've 100%ed something is like really rewarding. Oops. And then on the opposite of that, we have punishment. So punishment enables risk and excitement. It makes rewards seem valuable. It increases challenge. So there's room for punishment in the experience as well, right? But on the opposite end of that, psychological studies have shown that people really hate the feeling of something being taken from them. So it's something that you want to be a little bit careful with. People don't like to feel like they've had a reward taken away that they worked really hard to get. They don't like having their time wasted, so it can be really frustrating to like lose progress because you died and there wasn't a checkpoint. We've been talking about Souls games. They have to tread pretty lightly with that too, but they have at this point built up the trust of their players such that players generally know when they have failed, and it doesn't feel unfair to have died and lost some progress. So some examples. These are kind of the opposite of our rewards, right? You could use shaming. I don't really recommend it, but this is a way that you could do it. So you could, in DDR, when you miss arrows a lot, they like boo you. You could have a loss of points, a loss of playtime, terminated play, a setback of some kind. And I was going to put forth that setback is the usual punishment for failure or dying, is that you have to start back a little further than you were. But how much setback you give, it's really dependent on genre. So Celeste, for example, just starts you at the beginning of the room that you were already in, whereas something like Dark Souls could set you back like a whole level. Removal of powers or resource depletion. And then finally, we have feedback loops. So feedback loops happen when the game system makes decisions that are based on a player's previous decision. You can have positive and negative feedback loops, and there is a link here to watch if you're interested in learning a little bit more about these. So if you remember this, again, this is our diagram of the game system, but this is also a diagram of a feedback loop. It is not necessarily positive or negative. It's kind of a neutral feedback loop. But there is literally feedback in it, right? There's an input's taken by the game program, output's a rule. That rule creates some feedback. The player uses that feedback to make a new decision. This is the definition of a feedback loop. So in a positive feedback loop, and I should say here, positive and negative in this instance don't refer to like the player's emotional state or anything like that. They're not like good or bad. Positive simply means that when a player makes a choice, their choices are amplified over time. So there is some kind of like growth over time, and generally kind of some exponential change in the game state based on player choices. So it amplifies changes over time. So for example, when a team in Team Fortress 2 captures several bases, the game makes it easier and easier for them to continue capturing bases and win. And part of the reason for that is you don't want matches to go on forever. So you want a few early wins to amplify and make it easier to win the match overall. And the opposite goes for the losing team. It makes it harder and harder for them to win. Whereas a negative feedback loop will resist changes over time. So this happens when the player's choices are resisted. So for example, power-ups in Mario Kart are unevenly distributed so that players in the last place always have a chance to catch up and change the outcome of a race. The blue shell always targets the player that's in first place. So this is an example of a negative feedback loop where we're trying to resist, whoever's in the lead from like completely overwhelming the race, and instead providing these instances of change and randomness to some degree, but uneven randomness, such that players can catch up. And part of that is because Mario Kart's a party game. You're supposed to play it with people you know and like, generally. Like, I think that's probably in their pillars. And so they want to make sure that everybody's having a good time. And one of the ways for people to have a good time is for them to have these chances to catch up, or even these chances to, like, have a spectacular fail. It's still kind of fun. So that's an example of a negative feedback loop. So all the methods that we just talked about can be used to help balance economies in our game, as well as our other game loops. So you can try applying each of these methods to each economy in your own game, and I would love if you wrote about some of the economies and some of your methods of balance in your game design document under the mechanics section.